Today is April 13th. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. And today I'm going to be answering some of your questions about the present day in politics, although they are largely today more general than specific, which is fine because, as I say, I didn't really have time to prep a lot today. So I want to start here just for fun. Somebody asked about the history of birthdays, and I think you were being a little bit flippant, but I'm going to give it to you anyway because, and I'm not going to give you the whole thing, but one of the things that I find fascinating about the way that we celebrate birthdays in America is they really are indicative of the change. I'm so sorry. I'm just so sorry when I do this to you. I should probably just leave it at that, right? But they really are indicative of the changing economy of the late 19th century because until least the 1860s, people didn't pay a lot of attention to their birthdays. In fact, you could go all the way back to the Puritans, where you didn't mention a lot of holidays, but there simply wasn't time. There certainly a birth would be recorded in the family Bible if you had one, but it wasn't. Nobody made a big deal about it because it was just one more day in people's lives. But after the Civil War, with the rise of what we now call white collar professions, with the idea of people working for railroads, for example, and being able to keep their collars clean, right? The collars that came on and off the shirts. People had more leisure time and they had more money. And it's in that period that people begin to start paying attention to their children as being somehow separate. That is, they should have a period in which they are not instantly put to work, that they have a period in which they are treated specially and somewhat differently. And so we get the rise in the late 19th century of the idea of not only birthdays, also Christmas. This is when Santa Claus is invented in his American incarnation as a bringer of good things to children. And similarly, the idea that you could actually give presents to your child on a special day and invite that child's friends over to play games, for example, is unusual. And this is, if you remember your Laura Ingalls Wilder in, I think it's one of the later ones. It might be these Happy Golden Years, or one of the later, Little Town on the Prairie, maybe it's Little Town on the Prairie. She talks about going to a birthday party, I think for Cap Garland, I don't really remember, and that they have an orange for everybody, that everybody gets to eat an orange, and it's folded in this funny way. And she'd never been to a birthday party before. And that was a sign that there was actually money coming into the town, that people could afford to do that for a kid. This is also the period when we get people celebrating weddings with fancy events, not only a wedding perhaps in a church that's decorated, but also the idea of wedding cakes, a special cake being made for originally the bride and the groom. There was a groom's cake and a bride's cake, and then of course the groom's cake went the way of all things, and the bride's cake, which was supposed to be decorated like the bride, which is sort of interesting if you're into consumption history, because the guests and the groom are literally eating a representation of the bride, which is, that's not really my thing in history, but it's something I don't think you can avoid, but that was originally supposed to look like a wedding dress. In any case, so the idea of celebrating children's birthdays actually is a late 19th century incarnation in America, and it comes from the new economy, which provides both money and leisure time. We also get the idea of hobbies in this period. We get the idea that people would, for example, play lawn tennis, as it was known, or start skiing for fun, as opposed to simply having on your days off just sitting in a chair sleeping because you're exhausted from the other 6 days of the week. So you joked when you asked me the history of birthdays, but I actually knew the history of birthdays off the top of my head. So there you go. All right, a little bit more to the point today, though. Oh, that's a good question that somebody asked. That maybe we should talk about the idea of teachers indoctrinating our children with lies. I'm going to write that down. I'm not sure I'll get to it because there's other stuff you all want me to talk about today. So one of the things that virtually everybody has asked is, I gave you what was essentially a throwaway line in a letter fairly recently about the recent Supreme Court decision and what was happening with that Supreme Court decision. And people complained that I didn't say more about it, and people have asked what I meant when I said something to the effect of, this new decision has given a lie to the idea that the court is apolitical. which is a position that that certain members of the judiciary have been trying to argue that in fact this Supreme Court is not political. And of course it is obviously worth remembering that there has been a major attack on the Supreme Court really since the Reagan administration, and it has swung very far to the right. It is the most of the justices were appointed by Republicans, as you know. I've written about this before. But so what happened in the decision of the other night was one that, and it dropped late at night, and it was a decision about whether or not the state of California, as I recall, again, I'm not as prepped as I normally am for these today because I was with my family right up until they left. Don't worry, I haven't abandoned them in the other room. And not because I chased them out, they had other places to be. The case was whether or not California could shut down prayer meetings in homes during the pandemic. And the rule, I believe, was that you couldn't have more than people from three pods or something. I don't really remember the details of it. But the reason that the decision mattered is because it cuts away at the First Amendment. And the First Amendment says that the government should be neutral in terms of religion versus secular activity. Because it should simply be neutral, which is the position that the dissenters took. But the case itself decided that the state could not tell people that they couldn't, there was a limit on any kind of private religious gathering. Because their argument was that the way the decision was written, as I read it, I'm not a lawyer, but as I read it, it said that that the distinction made in the law was that it was okay to open, for example, supermarkets and liquor stores because people moved in and out of them very quickly. Whereas in prayer meetings, when people are crowded together and perhaps singing, that they're going to exchange this disease pretty readily. And the Supreme Court said that, in fact, the California could not do that so long as it had permitted people to go unlimited people to go into a liquor store, for example. It could not say that you could not have a prayer meeting in your home, that you could go ahead and have religious gatherings regardless of the pandemic. So instead of saying, it basically tried to argue that the state had discriminated against religious organizations by saying that they couldn't gather even though liquor stores were open or whatever. That was one of the things they mentioned, so that's why it's in my head. But what the decision said was that the states basically had to go ahead and prioritize religion over public health, and that itself was concerning enough. Although one of the people tried to say was that we don't need to worry about it because it's moot. We're going to get rid of all these pandemic requirements soon anyway, and the justices went ahead and decided the case anyway, in order to make it clear that the three remaining liberal judges and Roberts, who is now sided with them at least on this case, are going to be outvoted in disputes that are based in religion. That is, that they are the old religious guard of Thomas and Alito are going to be joined by the three very religious justices that Trump put on the court to make a majority of 5 for anything that has to do with religion. And of course, that has been their big thing, is that they want to put religion back in the centerpiece of America. So when I said that it belied the idea of the Supreme Court being apolitical, quite literally the apolitical argument for the California law, which was not, we don't care if you're meeting over rum or over religion. We care that you're not in a space where you're going to be you're going to be endangering public health. In that case, the justices stepped in and said, no, religion is prioritized here. So that's all I meant by that when I threw that line in about it making belying the idea of the Supreme Court being apolitical, because of course it's a very political stance that that religion is going to trump pretty much anything. All right. So I'm watching your comments, and they're coming in really randomly. People are talking about the Supreme Court, and at the same time, people are talking about what they put in their Christmas stockings. So it's like, I'm going to try and keep looking at that. So other questions, though, are out there and are very much worth getting into. So I want to start here with one that's going to be easy to answer, and that's the fairness doctrine. So a lot of us, me included, make a big deal about the 1987 overturning of the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine was a policy of the United States government that said that if you were going to get a broadcast license, you had to agree both to have um, the material that you presented to the public be honest. You know, I mean, you could make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, just so you know. And the trick is, people who honestly correct their mistakes, you can trust. The ones who are like, I never make a mistake, are well, they're either gods who walk among us or they're lying to you. And I'm going to go with the latter there. Everybody makes mistakes, but including journalists. Sometimes you see this, especially if there's been a quick response to a story. People do make mistakes. I try not to come out too quick on something, in case you didn't notice, because I'm always afraid I'm going to have made a mistake. And especially if other people aren't saying it, I tend not to, or I spend many hours trying to figure out why I seem to think something that nobody else does. Sometimes I'm right on that, actually, but sometimes I don't. Last night I had information that I didn't quite trust, and so I didn't put it in the piece last night. But so the idea is that your news is supposed to be, under the Fairness Doctrine, is supposed to be fact-based. Now, you might be wrong about it, but at least you tried, you know. And at the same time, if you were going to take an editorial position, you were supposed to present the other side as well. And you can remember this by remembering the original Saturday Night Live, when Gilda Radner as Rosanna Dana, I think that's who it was, would come in and give an alternative opinion to the evening news with Jane Curtin and I guess it was Dan Aykroyd. And she always screwed it up. Like, my favorite remains that they did a show on euthanasia, that is putting people to death out of concern for their illness or whatever, and how they were opposed to euthanasia. And she came in and did a whole, with her sheets of paper, talking about that she thought youth in Asia was a very good thing, that Asian people should have lots of children and everybody loved children and so on. So the Fairness Doctrine meant that you were supposed, and that's why Jane Curtin used to get so mad at her on Saturday Night Live, because she was always out to lunch. But the idea here was that you had to present both sides of an issue. In 1987, the Federal Communications Commission under Ronald Reagan does away with the Fairness Doctrine, because the argument on the part of the movement conservatives, who at the time were trying to take over the American government, was that, or the Republican Party, and through them the government, was that focus on fact-based narrative privileged liberals. That is, the media was liberal. That's where we get the idea of a liberal media, and that is some kind of an epithet, because their argument was that if you based your arguments in facts, in verifiable information, that privileged people who operated in what later movement conservatives would call the reality-based community. And their point was they didn't want to work in the reality-based community. They wanted to be able to shape a narrative and to convince people based in a narrative that was not rooted in fact, but was rather rooted in what they considered to be ideological truths, ideological principles. And there's something else that just flashed by I want to tell you. So in 1987, the Fairness Doctrine goes by the wayside, and that instantly we get talk radio. I believe it's the next year that Rush Limbaugh moves to New York and becomes Rush Limbaugh. We get the rise of the right-wing media chamber really beginning after the end of the Fairness Doctrine. And then, interestingly enough, there was a fascinating picture, article on Limbaugh after he passed, that talked about the fact that he did not begin as a political speaker at all. He was a shock jock, and he moved toward politics because it sold. And the big thing for AM radio at the time was that it was a losing proposition, because FM radio delivered so much better sound that all the music stations were moving to FM radio, and so AM radio could deliver talk. And it delivered talk cleanly enough that people were willing to listen to AM radio. And so a lot of the shock jocks went over there just because they were trying to make money over there. And the argument in this piece about Limbaugh was that he was not politically motivated himself. so much as he was motivated by getting listeners. And what you got listeners with in the 1980s was with sort of political shock jockness, if you will. But so anyway, the what that did then is after that was in 87, and then by the 1990s you have the rise. First of all, there is Rush Limbaugh actually has a TV show that most people have forgotten about. But then of course we get the rise of the Fox News channel, and since then we've gone on both to internet channels and to things like Newsmax and OANN and all that. But people ask, how do we get back to a world where we are fact-based? Because we are all very aware of the fact that a number of our compatriots around this country do not live in the reality-based community, and increasingly seem to think that there is no reality, that everything is believable and nothing is believable, if you will. And I think nothing makes that clearer than the QAnon's focus first on what they think is a pedophilia ring, and then their refusal to accept the idea that one of their own might be involved in such enterprise, which is kind of weird, like, of course everybody's doing it, except my guy, which is just, in terms of I believe everything, I believe nothing, I think is a really good illustration of where we are intellectually in America right now. But there is this attempt from a lot of people to try and get back to the idea of the fairness doctrine. But here's the problem. I started out by saying the trick was to hello? The trick was to, somebody just walked into my house. The trick was to, the idea of the fairness doctrine was that in order to get a broadcast license, in order to get the license, you had to agree to do these things. But the problem, of course, now is that you don't have to have a broadcast license in order to reach a wide audience. And because of our Constitution, the federal government cannot regulate speech per se. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to come in here and tell me what I can or cannot say? Like, literally, what does that look like? Because the federal government cannot do it. They can't, under our Constitution, they can't mess around with what we say. We have the right to free speech. So the issue right now is that we have the problem of the Constitution, which says the federal government can certainly tell you you can't have a license to have access to the public, have a public channel. But if you don't need a license, how on earth does the government step into that? Now, that doesn't mean it's not doable. As somebody said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, but it will not be by the government stepping in and saying you can't say those things because they're not true. And before you think, like I'm obviously a big proponent of the idea that people should have to have their news based in reality, but I'm also not a proponent of the government getting to decide what that reality is. And it's really worth grappling with what is essentially a contradictory argument, because it's easy for me to sit here and say, well, pick your favorite Fox News channel personality, shouldn't be able to say X, we know it's not true. The big lie. The big lie is not true. That is a lie. The idea that Trump won that election, that is a lie. That is not true. But what about some of the stuff that's maybe not so clear? What about if you want something and somebody else doesn't want something? What may seem true to me does not seem true to everybody. And I don't think you want your government making decisions about what it says is true and what is not. Because think about that. Certainly in authoritarian states, that's exactly what they do. There is propaganda. There's political propaganda, and that's what everybody is supposed to believe, even when they don't believe it. And so it's not as easy as saying, let's bring back the fairness doctrine. But there certainly are things that I think are very interesting and very promising. And one of the problems that we have, there's really sort of an enlightenment argument here. Either you believe that people want to be told the truth and they want to have control over their lives, or you believe they don't. Like, that's really not negotiable. And I think that there are a lot of people, and I'm not going to be one of those people who says, oh, everybody wants to think for themselves. Like, I'm 58 years old. I know a lot of people don't want to think for themselves. It's a lot easier to have somebody tell you what to think, I promise you. But I don't think that's the majority of us. So the whole concept of the Enlightenment was the idea that given the opportunity to have facts presented fairly, people would listen and they would make good decisions. Not 100% of the people. Everybody always says to me, like, how are we going to bring the last 20% along? You're not. You're never going to have that many people. But that's the whole concept of representative government is so long as you have 51% or 50% 0.1, you're going to go ahead and move your society in a good direction. So if you believe in the ideas of the Enlightenment, as I do, what you need to do is you need to preserve an open marketplace for ideas. And that's a place where it is possible for the government or for different government entities to be involved and for people to be involved. I'll talk more about that in just a second. Um, the it's hard to be reading at the same time. So one of the things that has come to people's attention is, for example, the algorithms on Facebook are not even handed. They do, in fact, privilege right-wing voices. Because remember, on this medium on which I am currently using, it's a private enterprise. They're not looking to educate the American public. They're looking to make money. That's the way the system is set up. And you can't blame them for that. That's exactly what they were designed to do. There are many things you can blame them for, but they're not somehow being nefarious by trying to go ahead and make money. And one of the things that they want to do is they want to maximize clicks. They want to maximize people's attention. And the way to do that, they have discovered, is to slide toward people on the right who tend to be much less critical of the way they absorb information than other people. So the algorithms for what they show you privileges people on the right. Well, that's a place where you could, in fact, get involved. That's not regulating speech. That's regulating the algorithms by which you level the playing field for speaking. So you wouldn't shut up people saying that the world is flat, but you wouldn't privilege them either. So there are ways to do it. There are certainly ways. One of my favorite things, as you know, is that we have incredible numbers of trolls on this page. That's easy to solve. You know, you could stop there being trolls. You could get rid of troll farms simply by identifying them. They are identifiable. If I can identify them sitting here with my human eyeballs, there's absolutely no doubt that we can do it by more sophisticated means of electronic means. And you know, when I say we have trolls, I'm not sure you all understand that over the year or more here that I've been doing this, we have banned probably hundreds of thousands of people. But they're not really people, and you can tell because it's the same name keeps coming back again. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can tell, but there will be ways to do that so long as we have the political will to do it. So we can't really bring back the FCC. I'm sorry, I completely misspoke. We can't really bring back the fairness doctrine because it wouldn't do very much, and it runs into the Constitution. But there are other ways to accomplish what the fairness doctrine did. Okay, so that was an easy one to talk about. Here's another one. Filibuster. I talk about the filibuster all the freaking time. And the trick to the filibuster is, as you know by now, the filibuster is a vestige of the days in which there was no need to shut people up from talking in Congress. And the House had to put limits to debate early on because it got much bigger than anybody expected, much faster. The Senate didn't have to do the same thing. So it never developed early on. It never developed a way to make people shut up, which is essentially a filibuster. If you insist on continuing to hold the floor so that you don't shut up, nobody can take a vote. And eventually, what tended to happen was that what got filibustered were civil rights laws. And the trick to the filibuster was that eventually the Senate did have to figure out how to make people shut up, and they developed a system called cloture. Cloture means that when it is invoked, you have to limit debate for the next 30 hours. It's not quick. But the problem is that cloture takes 60 votes to enact. And so essentially when people say it takes 60 votes to break a filibuster, that's what they're talking about. So one of the questions somebody asked was, couldn't we go back to the system where people have to talk? Absolutely. We got away from that because it meant that that Senate business got really gummed up if somebody went ahead and filibustered things. But instead, what we have now is somebody just has to threaten to filibuster. And what that has meant is, of course, that it's actually, to me, it's deeply problematic. What it has meant, of course, is that people just have to say they're going to stop something in order to stop it. And what that does is it shifts the weight of governance, really putting the minority in power. So you have to work doubly hard to pass anything. But if you don't want to pass anything, all you have to do is say, nope. Nope. And that's not what we have ended up with, is a number of things that never get debated and they never get voted on because they're stopped by the filibuster. And that is problematic because there's a lot of stuff the American people want that we can't get because we can't get it through this filibuster, including, for example, the basic background checks that 55 members of the Senate wanted after the Sandy Hook gun massacre. But they couldn't get the extra 5 people. And so we didn't get that, even though it was enormously popular. And we also have the problem with the fact that the Senate is very heavily weighted right now toward the Republicans in the sense that disproportionately, in the sense that the 50 Republicans represent about 40.5 million fewer Americans than the 50 Democrats. So we only have 330 million people in this country. That's a pretty high difference between the two sides. So that also causes the problem of the fact that what we get there are 3 types of general bills that cannot be filibustered. There's also judicial appointments, and now Supreme Court appointments can't be filibustered, but the 3 categories of financial bills can't be filibustered. They were exempted early on. Not early on. They were exempted when the filibuster started to become really bad. And the problem with that now is that we get these mega bills. So because people can't get a discussion of, well, should we have a women's history museum on the mall? Because it just gets shot down. Instead, we get these mega bills that have everything in them. And I'm actually not a proponent of that at all. A lot of people are like, that's just the way it is. It's fine. And I'm like, no, we shouldn't. It's either take it or leave it. And it's everything in the kitchen sink or it's nothing. And it's like, that's not the way it's supposed to work. We're supposed to get actual debates and conversations. So the filibuster is a real issue. Somebody asked, could we go back to the days when they actually had to stand on the floor and filibuster? And the answer to that is almost certainly yes. Certain people have suggested that they do, in fact, want to get there. They do want to do that again because they're frustrated by the fact that they can't get anything even on the table. And so people have asked me what's going to happen with the filibuster. And again, once again, I'm sorry, somebody asked if I'm worried about who came into my house. Remember, I live in the middle of nowhere. It is virtually certainly a neighbor. I mean, not even it's either a neighbor or one of my sons. So don't worry. And people, we just go into each other's houses here. It's not a big deal, but it's not common since COVID. So don't worry about me. I'm absolutely fine. But so the filibuster thing is interesting though, because what I just said, and people are like, what's going on with Manchin? And I have some ideas about what's going on with Manchin. Don't forget Sinema down in Arizona. She, to me, is a much more interesting question. Manchin is getting all the attention right now because Manchin is a Democratic senator in West Virginia. And Manchin is a very interesting senator in many ways. He has been there a long time, and he has managed to he's managed to continue to get reelected, even as the state went increasingly red. And the reason that he does that is he delivers for West Virginia. And he is also, you can't forget, although he is a Democrat, he's also a very wealthy Democrat, and his interests tend to run with business. But think of the position he's in. And again, always remember that politics is a chess game. So think of the position that man is in. He is really the linchpin right now of the Democrats getting stuff through the Senate, and he's a Democrat in a Republican state. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, let's primary him. Well, whatever. It's going to be hard to get any other Democrat in West Virginia, at least the way the state currently looks. Now, of course, that's not necessarily always going to be the case. Things change and all that. But that's, I think, sort of a fantasy about getting rid of Manchin. But, it would be much easier, for example, to go ahead and take, and in the next cycle, pick up Democratic seats from other Republicans than it would be, and that would take Manchin out of the powerful position. So people are all yelling at Manchin, well, what about the fact that we just reelected Susan Collins here in Maine? That was a much easier seat in some ways, and one that it really looked like she was going to lose until at the very last minute, a very popular, long-standing public figure came out on her side. And a lot of people think that swung toward her. But in any case, so there's other places to go to move him out of the catbird seat. But that being said, why is he doing what he's doing? He's a terrific politician. You don't have to like him, by the way. This is like, me saying he's a terrific baseball player. He has the possibility right now of delivering quite a lot to his state by saying, in order to get me on board, you got to make it worth my while. And that's what Congress critters do. If they're good, they deliver for their states. So that's part of what's going on with Manchin. But the other thing about a filibuster, and this is so interesting right now, is that if we keep the filibuster the way it is, think of all the senators who don't have to vote on things they don't want to vote on. They don't want to have to take a stand on things. And not just Manchin, but a number of people. The people who can say, it's not going to come up in front of me, so I don't have to vote on gun control. I don't have to vote on infrastructure. I don't have to vote on all these things my constituents want, but my party doesn't. And somebody like Manchin, who's caught between a rock and a hard place, there's probably a lot of votes that he would rather not have to declare for. So it'll take a lot to move him off the filibuster. That being said, you people always ask me, is it possible? Is it possible? It is our country. If we want to get rid of it, we can get rid of it. We just have to go ahead and keep the pressure on to make that happen. Because as I keep saying, our current mechanics no longer fit our democracy. And that's not sustainable. One or the other has got to give. All right, so on that topic, somebody else, is there merit in keeping the filibuster? Somebody asked. Somebody asked me about this. Asked me the other day to make a case in favor of the filibuster. And it's interesting because I would have myself defended it a number of years ago because I like tradition. I really do. But then now that it's on the table and I'm thinking about it, like, no, they didn't use it in the 19th century. I mean, they really didn't. They took hard votes and they fought and they did all that. This is really a brand new thing. Not brand new, of course, it existed, but seriously, I don't know how many books I've written on Congress. I have never dealt with a filibuster. It's a 20th century thing, not the 19th century. They go through the entire Civil War without a filibuster. And there were certainly plenty of times when senators Democratic senators in the 60s and the 70s desperately wanted to stop Republican legislation, and they couldn't do it. They didn't do it. So, I'm sorry, the 1860s and the 1870s. So is there an argument in favor of it? The argument in favor that people make in favor of it is that it requires bipartisan legislation, and I call BS on that. Simply, again, because I've studied Congress as long as I have, what it has done, in fact, is it's made it possible for a minority really to dominate everything and to be able to say, no, we don't have to do that. And because of that, and because of the ability to stop people from taking the hard votes that they will have to vote, it has killed bipartisanship, not promoted it. And you can see this quite clearly if you look at any charts of how when the filibuster began to be used. It's very recent that it's been used the way it has, and a lot of it is that is Mitch McConnell as well. So it's really a product of it came after the partisanship, not before it. It is a product of the partisanship of the rise of the modern day Republican Party. It is not. It did not make that happen. It's a product of that. So I don't think there's any reason to keep it any longer, which kind of kills me to say. But I'll stop. All right. So that's the filibuster, and I did a Supreme Court case. Now here's some more fun stuff. Somebody asked again about the difference between a republic and a democracy, because you hear that all the time. And as I say, and this is not from me. There's a wonderful book called How Democracies Die by Zyblatt, and I can never remember the other guy. Somebody should put it in the chat because it's a team written book. It's a great book. still drawing a blank on it. Anyway, in which they said that saying that we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic, is sort of like saying I don't have a dog, I have a golden retriever. And that's a really good way to look at it, because the difference between a republic and a democracy is minuscule compared to the difference between a representative government and an autocracy, which is what's on the table right now. So we are, in fact, in a representative democracy, and that is the idea that we don't literally, if we were a democracy, literally, we should get, as individuals, should get to have a say on everything that happens in our government. And we don't. We elect our representatives to go and do that for us. Still, the authority of the government rests on the will of the people. End of discussion. That's what people are talking about when they talk about republics versus democracies. Do the people ultimately have the power over the government? Is it our government? Do we get to determine it, or just somebody else? And obviously an autocracy and the many different forms of that, an oligarchy, dictatorship, all those different forms say no, the people don't get to have a say. The people are told what to do. So, but what's interesting about that phrase, we don't live in a republic, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. First of all, there's history to that that matters, but I'm not going to go into it now because I want to touch some of the other stuff you talked about. But where that really came from was the rise of the John Birch Society and their attempt to make sure to come up with an articulate reason for why they didn't want Black people to vote, essentially. And you see this nowadays when people are saying nowadays we don't live in a republic, we live in a democracy. They are not making ideological distinctions amongst the founding fathers. They are trying to say it's okay to cut people out of the vote. And here's a newsflash, they're not cutting white men out of the vote. What they are saying is it's okay not to let indigenous people vote, or which is easily accomplished on reservations like those in South Dakota by moving the polling places off the reservation. They're saying it's okay not to let brown people vote, which we did in America by not publishing voting materials in Spanish for a long time. That how we do, but they're saying it's not okay. It's okay not to let Black people vote. Well, and we know how they're doing that. Get rid of the drop boxes, get rid of weekend voting, get rid of mail-in voting, things like that. So when they say we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic, what they're saying is it's okay to for people simply to be represented by these other people who are elected as to represent them, sort of generally. You are generally represented the same way, for example, that you could argue that indigenous people are technically represented by the fact that their state has representatives in Congress, and yet I suspect if you're Lakota, you probably are not feeling like the South. I could be wrong. I believe that the Lakota population is overwhelmingly Democratic, but I don't have those statistics in front of me. But I suspect you don't feel that the South Dakota legislature adequately represents you, would be my guess. I'm only guessing. So when they say we're not a democracy, we're a republic, if you're going to make that argument in a political science class or a philosophy class, excellent, I'm right there with you. And we could really argue about that at important lengths, because the whole question of size comes into that, because you have the issue of sort of interpersonal relationships depending on how big a unit is, and this is one of the things that shows up that Madison writes about in the Federalist number 10, when he talks about why he thinks that this republic is going to work in a way that it wouldn't in most people thought that a large republic would fall apart, and he's saying no, it won't. I mean, all those things matter if you're talking about it philosophically, but they're not talking about it philosophically. What they're saying is it's fine to go ahead and make sure that only white guys vote. And I'm really saying that baldly, but at the end of the day, that's exactly, I think, what they're talking about. And I want thank you, Levitsky and Zyblatt. That's it. Thank you very much, Fran. And it's a good book. It's called How Democracies Die. There it is. Charles Willard just put up How Democracies Die. I really enjoyed that book. I mean, enjoyed is maybe the wrong word. I did not usually when there's a cover that's all black, it doesn't do much for me. But I actually read that book walking and really liked it. All right, so that's what they're up to with republics and democracies. And I did the Fairness Doctrine, and I did that. All right, so I want to throw in something here. Maybe I'll throw that in later. All right, so there's republics and democracies. Okay, so now we're going to get down to the meat of it. Um, in terms of the time here. By the way, somebody has asked me about what's happening in Minnesota with the immediate resignations of the police officer who allegedly, and I'm people have called me out for using the word murder with relation to Mr. Floyd. And I have done that quite deliberately. I do try and choose my words pretty carefully. You can see last night I backed off on that and I called it a killing because, of course, Derek Chauvin has not yet, and who knows how it'll turn out, be found guilty. And I tend to be very careful about that because I know that often when you look at a lot of evidence, it looks really different than when you look at only some evidence. And so I'm actually one of those people who doesn't usually say, oh, he's guilty, look at that, he's guilty. And you'll notice when I talk about Matt Gaetz, I've said allegedly, because right now we don't have any evidence. We have a lot of rumors, and rumors are often wrong. And I will use as an example of this that when I wrote my book on the Republican Party, I can't tell you how much I hated that first Iraq war. I was living in London at the time. I was horrified. I hated George H.W. Bush. I thought the whole thing was a terrible idea. I thought, I could go on and on and on. And then I started studying him, and I started studying what was going on and what the arguments behind that war were. The first war, not the second war. And I came around, and that's what. So I'm really ready to withhold judgment. I'm having a hard time withholding judgment on the Chauvin trial because I saw that video along with everybody else, and I am unable to conceive of an earlier story that would change what I saw. Like I say, I'm trying to withhold judgment and to be careful about the way I talk about these things. So when I say that she allegedly shot the man, I wasn't there, haven't seen the tape, allegedly. She just resigned, and so did the police chief, as I recall. Now, mind you, I haven't been on the news all day. And somebody asked, what is my take on that? My guess, and I have not looked at it yet, my guess is it's really damage control, that this is going to turn out to be a really, really big issue. There's going to be enormous damage in the neighborhood, and that it certainly looks as if this is not going to end up looking good for that particular police department. That suburb itself had been identified as one that was sort of ripe for this kind of an event happening too. So that's not going to help either. So what's happening there, I can't say for sure. I will write about it tonight if it seems fitting to write about it tonight. But normally if there's that quick a response, it means that things are hot. The question I think maybe you're asking is it going to change anything? And I will say this only. The fact that the gentleman, and I'm afraid I don't remember his name, I'm sorry, in Virginia, that event in Virginia happened in December, and nothing really happened until that went viral. That film went viral of I believe it's a lieutenant colonel being pulled over and pepper sprayed and abused by police officers. That something didn't happen until it went viral. It does feel a little bit like momentum might be starting to build in terms of dialing back the current way that police use force, but I am not ready to call it anything yet. As a historian, I'm always thinking if I were writing about this in 100 years, and you can see patterns, but you can't always see endings. And in this case, I'm seeing a pattern, but I'm not ready to say it's an ending yet. So I'm sorry I don't have more on that. There's also, speaking of which, one of the patterns that I am watching is what's happening with the former president. And one of the things that is interesting about him is that he certainly seems to be losing power, which is interesting. And that brings up something else somebody asked, what do I make of the fact that both businesses and law firms are lining up against the state laws that are restricting voting in a number of states. They've been presented in 43 states. They've been passed in Iowa. People always forget Iowa. They've been passed in Iowa and Georgia, and Texas is currently has something very close to being passed, and they're in a number of other states as well. So what's interesting about this is that the businesses have been avoiding Georgia because of these laws that restrict voting. And I guess it was yesterday, I kind of have lost track of days, law firms have put together rapid response, if you will, groups to try and fight these voter restrictions. And what do I make of that? I make something that I think is quite interesting out of that, because to me it looks very much like Reconstruction. And one of the things that happened during Reconstruction was that there was a hue and cry from a lot of businesses about what was happening in the South when they stopped Black voting. And they have vigilante groups, and they go after Black and white, by the way, Republicans in the South. And businesses don't care. I mean, they don't care who's voting. They certainly like tax breaks and all things like this, and I'm talking about during Reconstruction as well. But what they don't like is instability. If you don't know that your consumer base or that your plant is going to be safe, you're not going to be able to attract investment. And it's not even so much that you necessarily care about your consumers or your plant. You care about investment. And investment is hard to manage at times when you have social unrest. And so businesses want to stop this at a local level because they don't want unrest. And they certainly don't want to make unhappy their buyers. You know, Coca-Cola doesn't, and Delta Airlines don't want to get their buyers upset, because if you look at the base of the Republican Party, it's very old. I think the median white voter right now, or I guess I just saw the statistics, the median white American is something like 57. And Black Americans are significantly younger, and Hispanic Americans are way younger. So why on earth are you, if you're Coca-Cola, why on earth are you going to be catering to the 60-year-olds? Because they don't drink that much Coke. I mean, you want the young people. So partly they're trying to protect their consumer base, and they're trying to protect their investments. But there's also something else on the table that you've asked about. And that is, like, why else might they be doing this? Remember that one of the things that's in front of Congress right now is the For the People Act, H.R. 1 or Senate 1, depending on which one goes forward. These are both voter protection laws, but they're not just voter protection laws. They protect the right to vote. They make it easier to vote. They end gerrymandering. They end partisan gerrymandering. And when that happens, there goes the Republican current parity in the House of Representatives, because the only reason they've got the numbers they do is because of gerrymandering. But it also gets rid of dark money. So the idea of fighting back now at the state level against voter suppression is, at least perhaps in part, because they would like to head off the dark money at the upper levels. Now I don't know if that's the restrictions on corporate giving at the higher levels. Now, I obviously have no inside scoop on this, but if it were me, and I wanted to, and I were running, Richardson Airlines, I would, which I'm obviously not, if I wanted to continue to be a player in national politics, I really wouldn't care about the voters. I would care about being able to dump as much money as it's humanly possible to dump into the political system. And if H.R. 1 passes, they won't be able to do that any longer. So, I think that might have a lot to do with why there is such universal outpouring of condemnation for Georgia, especially. There is, of course, also the fact, here's another piece, and that's that the Republican Party has tied itself to Donald Trump, and it has done so not for ideological reasons at all, but I think because what he did is, before the 2020 election, is he packed state offices in the Republican Party with his own people, and they're not that good. And, one of the things that dictators do is they put in power not so very good people. And who springs to mind here for me is always Chad Wolf, whom he put in as acting director of Homeland Security. And Chad Wolf had no resume at all. But the trick is for a dictator or somebody who's an aspiring dictator is you put into place people who are dependent on you because they can't make it on their own. And then they're going to fight to the death for you because they know that once you're out of office, they have no future. And he did that before the 2020 election because he was concerned that he was going to get pushback from other Republicans in the party, and then he might be challenged in the way that a couple of Republicans did, in fact, try to challenge him in 2020. And so now they're stuck with the fact that they have told their followers, their Trump followers, that he won the election. He didn't win the election. But now they're doubling down on it because literally, what is their option? Say, we lied to you? Yeah, that's going to go over big. Or we quit. I mean, that's the other thing they could do, but they'll never get back involved in politics without his patronage. So the Republican Party is increasingly going down this big lie road at the same time that it's pretty clear it is that he is increasingly unhinged, and that's saying something. But if you have been following it, I don't retweet them and I don't write about them because I think deplatforming him is very important. But if you at all look at the statements that are coming out of the former president, you will see he is not mentally well. And if you are, if you're a CEO, you're not stupid. And if you're looking at that, you're thinking, really? This is the person you want me to support who could tank my business with a tweet if he wanted to? So I think they're really kind of hoping to purge him out of, and his people out of the party, and to get the Republican Party back again. All right. So that's that question. Now here's a couple of, no, I want to end on that. So a couple of questions here, and then I'll let you go because I started late. So that was the law firms and business. So I talked there about business more than I talked about law firms. I think law firms are up to something different with their support for voting rights, and I think that is because they support the law. I mean, there are a lot of really wonderful lawyers who care about our democratic system, and their money base is not politics. Their money base is their clientele, which is also business, of course, but I don't think they're lobbying. I think they care. A lot of them actually care quite deeply. I know a number of people who are working to defend voting rights, and they're good people. All right. So here's a question that somebody asked: did FDR have to deal with the kind of anger that Joe Biden does? And similar questions about why Biden is getting such pushback with the idea of spending on on Americans, actually, for a change. And the answer to that question is, first of all, yes, FDR did get enormous pushback, but he had a much stronger congressional majority. Remember that. Always remember that, because he didn't have to deal with some of the crap that is going on right now with gerrymandering, for example. But he does get enormous pushback. So does Teddy Roosevelt, by the way. Teddy Roosevelt is almost a more interesting comparison because he's got pushback from his own party as well as from the Democrats. Roosevelt does. Teddy Roosevelt does. But FDR does, in fact, and it's worth remembering that when he first takes office, people are like, whatever, dude, just do something because we're going down the toilet here, which is obviously my paraphrasing what the world looked like in March of 1933, but it was bad. The Depression had been going on since 29, 4 years into a depression. It's not getting better. Hoover is telling everybody everything's fine, and it's clearly not. The banks are folding as Roosevelt comes into office, and he has to do something. And Congress is like, whatever, just do something. In fact, they passed his first Bank Act without reading it. Which, by the way, that was not actually what happened with the Affordable Care Act, which was debated for a number of months. That's again a myth. It's not reality based. Anyway, so they do push back on him, but it's really, the pushback really takes place in 37 after he wins the 36 election, when he begins to get frustrated that the Supreme Court has been knocking down his New Deal, elements of his New Deal. He suggests going ahead and putting more people on the Supreme Court, and when that happens, there is pushback on that because he kind of lies about why he's doing it. He says it's because they're old and they have too much work, when the reality is he's just tired of the way that they're deciding. I want to emphasize that that's not what's going on now. There is actually a legitimate reason to increase the size of the Supreme Court now, simply because the country's gotten so much bigger. I guess we were just looking up, in 1918, America was about 103 million people. And now we're at 331 million people, and we have not increased the size of the Supreme Court since 1869, although we have added 3 more circuits to it. By the way, when I originally wrote that the other day, I wrote that we'd added 4 new circuits. It is worth knowing when you read my stuff that numbers have very little meaning to me. And I actually spent several hours that night thinking in my head that 9 plus 4 equals 12. And this is why I make really stupid mathematical errors in my writing. And finally, just before I posted, I went, wait a minute, weren't there 3 more? And I remembered literally there were 3 more circuits, not that 9 plus 4 didn't equal 12. Anyway, so now we have the issue of the fact the Supreme Court has a heck of a lot more business in front of it than it did then. But in any case, so he starts to get pushback. And the reason that I belabor that a little bit is because what happens is in 1937, a group of Republicans who hate the fact that he is regulating big business and a group of Southern Democrats who hate the idea that he is beginning to flirt with the idea of desegregation, desegregating workplaces, for example. He's actually treating African Americans not entirely like dirt, although he's certainly not treating them equally. And Eleanor Roosevelt is making it a point to try and increase the rights of African Americans in the country. There's a real pushback in 37, and the group of Southern Democrats and largely Western, but also some Eastern Republicans come together and they write a document called the Conservative Manifesto. And the only reason that most people don't even know about that, it doesn't show up in many places, but I actually plan to be writing about it soon. And one of the things, the reasons that it's important is at the time it's not important at all. As soon as the New York Times breaks the story that these Congress critters are ganging up on FDR to do this, they disband and they're like, we don't know, we know nothing about this. We had nothing to do with it. But what happens is the Conservative Manifesto goes ahead and it gets picked up by the Chamber of Commerce and it gets circulated throughout the country. And the reason, again, that I'm belaboring this is that it says, listen to what they said to do. They said that Congress, the government should not regulate business. It had no business providing a basic social safety net that belonged to charity, basically private charities, and that it should not promote infrastructure because that was the idea that should be private enterprise that did that. And there were a number of, I forget how many points there were in the Conservative Manifesto. It was either 10 or 20 or something. Takes up the above the fold in the Times. But although I don't believe it was published above the fold, I think it was below the fold, but whatever. It's been a while since I looked at it. But the reason I mention it is because when people now talk about conservatives, okay, many people think about conservatism and they think about Edmund Burke, who is the father of conservatism, who was writing in reaction to the French Revolution and saying that a government should never govern according to ideology. It should govern according to, what works, and to try and preserve stability by stabilizing the family, stabilizing the institutions in a society that promotes stability, like the church, like education, like all the sort of things that solidify stable property, things that keep things stable, as opposed to governing by ideology, as they're doing in France during the Revolution, which says that the world should look a certain way, and until it does, we're going to lop off heads, essentially, is what he's saying. That when people talk about conservatism, they are generally thinking about that philosophical conservatism. But that philosophical conservatism never came to America. People don't talk about being conservative in America until Lincoln, and Lincoln uses it in an entirely different way, which I won't tell you about now. Someday I will. But when people talk about modern day conservatism, in fact, today's conservatives are nothing like Burkean conservatives, and they're nothing like Lincoln conservatives. What they are is they're conservatives from the Conservative Manifesto. This idea that they are standing against the New Deal. They're going to stop business regulation. They're going to stop the social safety net. They're going to stop infrastructure. And that is when they're essentially the people who came to be called movement conservatives are literally from 1937 standing against FDR. So FDR did, in fact, have to stand against those people. But the difference between him and Joe Biden today is multifold. So one of the issues for Biden today is he's up against the same people, right? They want to get rid of the government that we have had in place now since 1933, and really taking off in the 1940s, this government that protects Americans and that does stuff we need and stuff we like. They don't like that, and they are standing against that, and they've had more than 60 years to entrench themselves in that. And also to build up now 2 generations of Americans who have listened to them saying that this is communism or this is socialism. It's not. What they're talking about is, again, they're tying into the American history of fear of socialism that comes out of Reconstruction. The idea that if Black people vote, they're going to want stuff, and that's going to have to be paid for through taxes on white people. And I talk about that a lot, so you've heard about that. But so the Biden's got to deal with that. He also has to deal with the fact that that wing of America now, especially under Trump, has legitimized and has weaponized white nationalists, white supremacists, dangerous people. And that's something that FDR, there certainly were people flirting with that out there, with the idea of America first, as you know. They certainly are talking about the idea of fascism, and fascism being the idea that it will move the state forward much more efficiently, much the way Nazis are talking nowadays and white supremacists are talking nowadays in America. So he's got that weaponized and legitimized by the former president. But he also has something else new. And that's that I keep saying about Biden is that people talk about how he's bringing back the New Deal. No, he's not. He's bringing something new. He's bringing the philosophy of the New Deal, the idea that the government should, in fact, respond to the will of the people. But the people to whom Biden is responding is not the heteronormative nuclear family. It's not the white guy making sure he's got enough money to feed his kids and his wife. Biden is responding to a new world, and it's a multivalent world, but it's a world in which he is working to bolster children, and children who are not necessarily part of traditional nuclear families. And he's responding to the needs of women who are, this whole idea of a nuclear family is really a weird concept in American history. It's a lovely thought, but very few of us ever lived that way. If we did, it was mostly after World War II. And he is taking on what is essentially a myth and saying, I'm not going to legislate according to myth any longer. Let's start where we need to start, which is with children, whether they're the children of trans people or biracial people or single moms or 2 dads. I don't care. I care that we're taking care of the children. And so he is not only taking on the movement conservative ideology with regard to government, he is also taking on the ideology with regard to the structure of society and the family. And to me, it's revolutionary because he's going toward a much more community-centered kind of vision, which is frankly what most of us always lived in without it being identified by the government as being central to our societies. So this is one of the reasons our histories are changing, when all of a sudden people are saying, hey, wait a minute, we always talk about how this guy did this, but really it was actually the women in the community who organized this. To start with the March on Selma, for example, where people pay attention to the men who were on the bridge, it was organized by a woman. There's this whole sort of community concept that he is taking forward, which I think sits hard with a lot of people. So he's dealing with that as well. But let me end here. People are asking me again and again, as always, can we do anything? And things like For the People Act and what about getting through the infrastructure bill and the things that people really care about? These are very popular things. And the Republicans are stopping them through the filibuster, through trying to convince people that they're bad and all that. But these are actually, when I say these are popular, like usually in politics, when we say a bill is popular, that's 54%. The coronavirus bill, the American Rescue Plan, 77% of Americans like that. So that's, when I say this is popular, this is like nobody gets that kind of support. So these are popular bills. But how do we, is there any hope for the People Act? Is there any hope for the transportation? Is there, I'm sorry, the American Jobs Act? Is there any hope? And the answer to that is, of course there is. But we have to put skin in the game. It is our government. And if we demand it, we can have it. But we have to demand it. And once again, people always ask, how do we do this? And there's the obvious answers: give to causes, run for office, speak up, call everybody. But there's also what I keep saying, take up oxygen, change the public conversation, make it so that when a 20-year-old young man is shot in his car, whether or not he has done something wrong, he belongs in the justice system, not dead in his front seat. Make it so that the person who pulled the trigger doesn't simply get put on leave and brought back to the force, that that person is forced to retire. Change the public conversation, put pressure, put social pressure on people, as well as just simply by taking up oxygen. I know a lot of the people who listen to me are not going to be people fighting in the streets, but you can say to a grandchild, you can't talk that way in my house. We don't talk that way in this house. This is what we care about in this house. And stop acting like it's okay to put up with the world that we've put up with for at least a generation. So I read a lot today about people saying that they had no hope any longer. Prominent people, and they would keep fighting, but they didn't have any hope. And I thought, of course there's hope. And saying there's no hope in a funny way seems to me to be coming from a very privileged position. The idea that maybe now you're not getting your way, but you know what? Most of us never got our way. And those people kept plugging, and they kept fighting for what America really could be. And it's a wonderful moment to look at Fannie Lou Hamer and people like her who didn't give up. And so I wanted to leave this on a happy note today and say, yeah, we're tired, and we're tired of reading the news and all that stuff, but it's not over. This game is not over at all. Anyway, so I'll let you go. Thank you for being here, and I will see you on Thursday. No, yes, I don't even know what day of the week it is. If it's Tuesday, I'll see you Thursday. If it's Thursday, I'll see you. Actually, won't see you next Tuesday. I should tell you that, because I'm getting my next vaccine. But I'll see you Thursday, and I'll be writing. So thank you for being here.